Hello, this video lecture is taking us from the first chapters of the textbook where we talked a lot about the ethics, the foundations, kind of the mental approaches you need to take to research, why it's important, all those fun things. And now we're starting to get more specific in how to actually create and implement and conduct and analyze our research. So we're starting out with the lens of the scientific method of inquiry. And so this has been mentioned a couple times. This is kind of the framework of making research kind of solid and valid and not just like, oh, I think I'm just going to go ask some questions to people. It's setting it up in a way that creates consistency and validity for your findings. This was the focus of Chapter 7, and it does start to introduce the different research approaches, the quantitative, qualitative, and mixed method. We're going to introduce those today and kind of give a brief overview of what each of them entails. We're going to go into more in depth on class on Monday about the specifics of them. Ultimately, for the outcome of this class, you'll be doing your research project, but you're only going to be picking one of the methods. And so, yes, you have to have a good understanding of each one, but you'll be implementing just one specific one. And so the textbook, these lectures are going to be very helpful when you are like, what do I need to do again for this one? Because there's a lot of specifics and nuances of how to approach it. Not the intent of this video. This is just to introduce you the concepts and kind of the framework of thinking and the philosophy behind each approach that you could possibly use. Again, this is Chapter 7. You read it for class, but it'll have more detail if you need clarification. All right, so here we go. Before you decide which approach you want to select, quantitative, qualitative, mixed method, you're going to want to ask yourself a few questions about the purpose of your research, because that is ultimately going to drive the type of approach that you take. And I think this first question right here is kind of duh, but it really is the most essential piece of the puzzle is, what am I trying to find out? If you go back to the previous chapters when we talked about kind of that knowledge continuum of when I don't know a lot, I just kind of want to get some exploratory data. When I know more, I am in a better position to do some explanatory research. So you want to really look at that. What are you trying to find out? Are you just trying to find out more information in general so you can educate yourself to make more of a specific research study? Or do you actually have a lot of knowledge and you want to start looking at causality, or is interventions effective, and look at more of the descriptions and details that can come from having more knowledge? That is going to drive you right there. This is why it's important to formulate a research question, because how you frame your research question will drive how you create your research study. So that builds for number 2, what kind of focus on my topic do I want to achieve? Do I just want more detail? Am I explaining something? If you have the question of an apple a day keeps the doctor away, are you trying to prove that? Like, are you looking to prove out or disprove a hypothesis? Or are you just trying to do some exploratory discussion around a topic? Number 3 connects back to why we do the literature review, is we're looking at what have other researchers done regarding this topic. Have they all really focused on quantitative research? And that tends to be the tried and true most effective way of getting information around this topic. Or is there still gaps in literature and research and knowledge that maybe I want to pivot and do a qualitative research because there's so many questions that are not being answered? Should I deviate from what's been done before in order to enhance the knowledge that already exists? So you want to look, do you want to align with other existing literature, or do you want to open up a new dialogue and conversation by implementing a different one? Number 4, what practical considerations should sway my choice? This is one that's actually pretty present for this class. Is, we're on a time frame. This class has an end date to it where you have due dates and have to do presentations and get to the end of the semester so you can get your grades and all that fun stuff. And so you don't want to design some sort of research study that is going to not be achievable or realistic within the time frame. That's a really, really big question to take into consideration. Do you have the resources? Do you have the time in your personal schedules to do something a certain way? Do you have the population sample that you need? So all of those questions, you need to look at the logistics as well when you're creating your approach. Number 5, will I learn more about this topic using a specific approach? There's values to the quantitative, qualitative, and mixed method. Those are all questions that we'll kind of flesh out through this through this PowerPoint as well when we talk about them more in depth in class, because there's pros and cons and advantages to each of the methods. And really, what approach works best for me? You can base that off of your comfort with each one. Do you feel like you have the skills to implement a really good qualitative approach? Do you have the confidence to do quantitative? Do you just suck at math? And so maybe numbers and quantitative calculations and analysis do not align with your skill set, and that's okay. Maybe conversations are better, and so qualitative would produce more purposeful outcomes as well as be very meaningful for you as well. These are all good questions. There isn't necessarily right or wrong answer to each one, and I think that really connects well with this is which approach is best, and that's really determined by the question or hypothesis, as well as the researcher's own personal preferences, philosophical views, and desires within the research scope. So I would love to say, like, you should always do this when this presents itself. That's not necessarily true because there's a lot of subjective factors that come into it. But what I want you to know is that all of these approaches are equally important to the social work knowledge field. Like, they all have a place within it and it all brings value. And so selecting one versus the other does not make you a better or a worse researcher. They all have value within the scope of social work research. So bopping back to this slide, so now I've referenced quite a few times the quantitative, qualitative, and mixed method approach. And so here's kind of a general summary of what each of these entail. Quantitative. The key word in here I always look at is the quantity. So that makes me think of numbers. How much? How many? And so quantitative data really seeks to find numbers in analyzing those numerical data. And so actually having numbers or attaching a label or a measurable value to some sort of variable makes it fall under the quantitative data. Now it's important to know that sometimes they use statistics to test the hypothesis before actually carrying out the study. We'll go into more detail about what that means on Monday, but that kind of differentiates it from the qualitative, which is when sometimes you generate the hypothesis and generations during the research study based on the data that comes out. But I am jumping ahead. So I like this little graphic right here. It kind of reminds me of a survey, thinking about those check boxes, very, very objective. Quantitative is numbers, objective, kind of concrete, value-driven data. Qualitative. Looking at this, I think of quality. Now, I kind of don't like that one just because I think sometimes quality has an association with good or bad. Like if it's good quality, it has more. If it is bad quality, it's lesser. So I don't love that viewpoint of quality. I think it's just more of like the description and the details and bringing an enhancement to very objective data. So qualitative tends to be more in the subjective realm. This little icon down here, kind of that conversation bubble, because often the qualitative data that you gather is done through conversations, more open-ended questioning, because it allows more of a narrative to happen versus just the like yes, no, X, Y, Z, that type of thing. Mixed method, I think from its title, can be pretty self-explanatory. It is a marriage of quantitative and qualitative, but this is done in a very purposeful and systematic way in order to enhance the data that is found. So all of you have been in a class of mine before. And at the end of the classes, I tend to give you all a course evaluation where I have you talk about the effectiveness of the class, what worked well, what didn't. And that is a really good example of a mixed method approach. There's a lot of yes or no scaling questions in there where you attach a number value to your satisfaction or your ease of the assignments, your engagement in class, your level of participation. But then I often ask like a follow-up question is, please explain your answer. Or there's questions on there, what assignments did you like the best? I could write all of the assignments out and have you do it on a scaling number from 1 to 0, which one's your favorite, which one's less, but I leave it open-ended to give you room to explain why these assignments were more beneficial than, let's say, a different one. So that, to me, is a very concrete example of what a qualitative study, or a mixed method research approach looks like. I'm using quantitative to gather data, but then qualitative to enhance my knowledge and get insight into what worked well and what didn't. All right. Talked about that. So quantitative research, number, objective. That's the keywords with quantitative research. It's usually deductive in nature. So it's seeking to find something and attempts to draw a large and representative samples of people so that findings can be generalized to a larger population. And so the findings, some of the good characteristics of a quantitative research is a really strong large sampling size, a diverse sampling size, so you can get lots of different perspectives and insights, because the key is if you can figure out something consistent throughout a large and diverse population, you can then start to make kind of the assumption that what you're finding is in fact true. So this is the crispy nugget that comes along with kind of quantitative and objective research, is thinking about physical researchers. So that's researchers who are doing something that's not necessarily doing a research subject or research project on human subjects. Maybe it's looking at some sort of science experiments using chemicals and that realm. They're often able to be more objective than social work researchers because we are more often than not working with human beings. And so it does pose a difficulty being super objective within social work research, because humans by nature are subjective creatures. And so if you think about, you're attempting to gather very quantitative data and you are asking a client about their level of anxiety that particular day, or you're trying to figure out their anxiety. So you might have these very quantitative questions, check yes or no, rate your level of severity. If you've been to a doctor's office, you often have the PAQ, which is an anxiety survey. But this could be very dependent on, is something going on in their life that actually is making them extra anxious that day that is an anomaly to their normal baseline anxiety? Are they worried if they answer in a certain way that they might get prescribed a medication they don't like? Are they worried that if they answer in a certain way, their medication might be discontinued and they're nervous about that? Are they worried they might hurt their social worker's feelings if they identify high anxiety, because then they feel like their social worker doesn't feel like they're doing a good job? And so we cannot always assume that our client who is answering is being 1000% objective in how they are answering, because they are human. And so that does present a little bit of a barrier or consideration when you are doing quantitative research, because you want to be mindful about biases and how even at your attempts to be purely objective, you are potentially working with subjective research participants. So the key word that comes along with quantitative data is this thought of positivistic way of thinking. So my first gut was like, oh, this means that people are being positive. Not necessarily. It is really striving to reduce uncertainty. So going from this subjective maybe not to, nope, this is a fact. This is universal in how things should be approached. That is really the intent of quantitative data, to rule out as much uncertainty as possible. And so they do this in various ways. And so I'm going to run out of time on this video. So look forward to me breaking these down in part 2 of this lecture.